Potato. I still don't know why we do that.
Well, we don't, because you don't say it when I say it.
It's because I line everything up in post.
What an editor.
Hey, I take out the space between our words sometimes. And if the audience knew how many times we said and then paused while we thought about stuff, they would just stop listening.
They wouldn't respect us as much as they do.
Nope. We got a lot of respect.
Well, let me just tell you, Phil, I was looking at the number of views for some of these videos, and it's obvious we're getting a lot of respect here. Yep. 17.
17?
17?
That's 16 more than I thought we were going to see it.
Not going to lie, some of those are probably me, so it's less than we'd like.
Still pretty good, though. Still pretty good.
Welcome to East Asian Adventures, the show that has a new name every episode. I'm Luke, and here's...
Phil.
That's Phil.
So what are we going to talk about today?
Well, last week, by this point it's like 2 weeks ago, but by the time you're hearing it, it might be 3 or 4 weeks ago. But in the past, we talked about trains in Japan and China.
You're supposed to call that last time.
Yes. We have the technology to describe things in the past, relatively. But we talked about trains, and trains are great. But it turns out there are multiple ways to get around that aren't trains. We have a lot of different wheeled vehicles we use in our daily lives, and this episode's going to talk about those things.
Wheeled vehicles that aren't trains.
Yes. Some trains don't have wheels, so kind of got to separate them. Yeah, so I guess just to get started talking about vehicles, before coming to Japan, I had this notion of Japan being a country of trains.
Because that's the propaganda they send out.
Yeah, so it's like America drives and Japan does trains. And they don't need cars in Japan because you have trains. And then I studied abroad here and I didn't need a car because I had trains and I could get everywhere in Osaka from a train. And the one time that we didn't go by train, we took a bus and it was great. And then I am living in Tottori where there's one train station and the train comes every hour. We needed a car. So I've been driving for the last 6 months or so in Japan. And I looked it up before the show so that I could seem smart. But Japan's actually 15th in the world for number of cars per 1,000 people.
15th in the world for number of cars per 1,000 people.
Right. So they might not have more cars than countries with higher populations than them, but they have a higher ratio than almost, that's higher than Germany, than France, Austria.
For comparison, where does the U.S. fall on this scale?
The U.S. is third.
Really?
So the US has almost 800 per 1,000 people. Japan has about 600 per 1,000 people. And the only places that beat the US are Monaco and San Marino, which I think is just small islands of rich people.
Yeah. Where it's probably 100% of the people have cars.
Yeah. San Marino has 1,200 cars per 1,000 people.
Yeah, so that's over.
Yeah, but they're just a tiny dot.
Mm-hmm.
They're like a pretend country. No offense, San Marinians.
Oh, we have a big audience from there.
Yeah, all 30,000 of them. Contrary to my ideas of Japan being only for trains, people drive here a lot, and it's sort of necessary if you don't live in a big city. And it's very different because a lot of the roads that we drive on weren't made in the 1900s. They've been revised, paved in the 1900s, but some of these roads are 2, 3, 4, 500 years old.
Oh, wow.
They have these strange shapes that were not built for driving on, but people drive on them anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So the road outside of my apartment has certain areas that a car does not fit through with another car. So as you're driving, you have to stop and let the other person drive past you so you can pull out of the way at certain spots, because each side of the road has a drainage ditch in it that if you drive into it, you won't be able to get out. It's 2 feet deep.
So the roads are very narrow, and when they paved them, they didn't make them wider. They just paved what was there.
Right, because the property lines never changed. So they couldn't take people's houses away and be like, we're going to make this road straight. They were like, well, it's wide enough in some places. We're just going to pave what we got. Good luck, guys. But the most extreme version of that I've experienced is Haley and I were going to see a special illumination in the mountains. And so I was driving in the mountains at night, and on my left was a cliff that if I had driven off of, we would have fallen into a river and died. And on the right was a mountainous wall, and the road was just barely wide enough to fit another car through. And another car came by while we were driving on it. And it was the most tense and stressful situation in my life. Because I'm driving and Haley's like, you can't go any further to the left. You cannot go any further to the left. And I was like, I gotta go further to the left or they're gonna hit us. But we made it and we survived. But when you drive on roads like that, there's this stressfulness that, I don't know, maybe people who are used to it don't feel that way, but it's just stressful to drive on roads that are so thin.
Yeah.
But, you know, the roads are really old, and it costs a ton of money to make a mountain road in the middle of nowhere that no one drives on an extra 2 or 3 feet wider so that all the cars can fit.
Mm-hmm.
So I get it. But speaking of cars, these roads are even smaller than you would think because the Japanese not mostly, it's like 50-50 maybe, drive what's called a K car, or like a mini car. And I did research into this because I don't know anything about cars. So they measure engine displacement using cubic centimeters, and we measure it using liters. Thankfully, my learning from science class tells me that 1,000 cubic centimeters is 1 liter, so you can just convert them like that. For example, the van that our parents drove when we were young, the Ford Windstar, has like a 3-liter displacement. Okay. So that would be 3,000 cc engine, if I understand it correctly. The Japanese K car, like the one that I drive, is maxed out. It cannot have a higher displacement than 660 cubic centimeters. So that's like less than a fourth of what that van was. We recently switched cars, but our old car was unable to accelerate on hills. If you went up a hill, you would lose speed, even if you were flooring it. It just couldn't do it. I can, like, shake the car by pushing it. I think I could flip it over if I wanted to. They're these tiny little things. They're, like, 5 feet tall. They weigh, like, a couple 100 pounds, it feels. On the plus side, I want to say we get 60 miles to the gallon plus.
Oh, wow.
When I came here, it was sort of like, why is everyone driving these toy cars around? They're so small. What are you going to do with that? But a lot of times you're driving on those small little roads and you're glad that you're not driving a pickup truck or something large because you would just die. You didn't drive it all in China, did you?
Oh, no. My goodness, no. That's terrifying. If people are actually interested in what stuff is like in China road-wise, I have to recommend a book called Country Driving. It's a book by Peter Hessler, who is a journalist who has lived in China for quite some time. Anyway, he wrote a book in 2010 talking about getting a driver's license in China and what it was like to drive in China. And the stories he tells are just mind-boggling to someone who's lived in the States almost their entire life. Because of how China developed, roads are still pretty new. I guess at this point, they're probably reaching 20 years old for a lot of stuff with their infrastructure.
Right.
But at the point where he was, and maybe even 30 years, but at the point when he was writing this book, it was 10 to 15 years from when a lot of the roads and cars were just starting to become a thing in China. He said for people to get their driver's license, they had to take tests that came up with by the people who were giving the instructions. Everyone's learning to drive on these manual transmission cars. And he says, okay, you have to go from parked to second gear. You have to skip first gear because first gear is easy. And if you learn to jump over first gear, you'll be a better driver. So, like, that was the thing they had to do. And so when he went to get his license, he had to take this 100-question quiz. I guess they have 400 questions, and they ask you 100 of them. And you take all of these, and then you do your driving test. And when he does his driving test, he basically drives down the road like 100 meters on this closed-off space. And then they said, okay, you're good.
Oh.
Apparently today it's still difficult to get a driver's license, and just owning a car is really expensive.
Right.
Now, you talked about kind of how tiny cars are.
Yeah.
I think in the last show you said if you take a normal car and a Matchbox car, it's somewhere in between, kind of near the middle.
Yes.
All of the cars I saw in China were normal what I would consider normal-sized cars. Now, the vans and the trucks were all really tiny.
Right.
But all of the cars and the SUVs, they seemed pretty normal size.
Oh, that's interesting. To me, China is the place where everyone has a bike and there's no space to drive. And the people who do drive, like, don't get anywhere. I've heard about those horror stories of, like, traffic jams that last for weeks and people are, like, ditching their cars on the road. And
I saw a news article when I lived in Zhuhai, and I think we were somewhere in the top 10 of the worst traffic cities in the world.
Oh.
It was exciting. I was like, yeah, we're number 10. We're number 10. I was surprised. There were a lot of car brand names that were familiar to me. I saw Mini Coopers, but they were the Countryman Mini Coopers. So they always had like the bigger version of the Mini Cooper. Saw some Ford Fiestas and things like that. And then there's a bunch of like European brands or Chinese brands that I had never heard of. BYD, I think, was one. And there was one that looked like a little lion or something, which I had never seen before.
So they did like all sorts of brands.
Yeah, all sorts of brands. And a lot of them looked new. They not only took care of them and washed their cars regularly, but I just think a lot of the cars were new. The trucks were all old and rusted.
Yeah, now when you say trucks, I'm guessing we're talking about the same thing when you mean it's like a short, boxy square thing with a tiny bed.
Yes.
And like, it's usually white, at least in Japan.
Yeah, white or rusted out.
And the driver is an old person?
Yeah, you usually have one person driving and smoking and somebody else with their feet up on the dashboard also smoking.
Do they have old people stickers in China?
No. Tell me about old people stickers.
So in Japan, once you reach 70, you have to go in to get your license like renewed or something. You obviously don't have to take a test because some of these old people clearly can't drive anymore. But they give you a sticker. It's not really a sticker. I think it's magnetic that you have to put on the front and back of your car. So new drivers also get a magnetic plate. That's like a insignia that makes it like, this is a new driver. Give them some space. They don't know what they're doing. And so for old people, the sticker used to be a leaf that was orange and yellow, like a withering leaf. And I guess some people who are old found that offensive because it was basically saying like, be careful, these people are about to die. And so they recently changed it to a 4-leaf clover with different colors. But what that means is if you see an old person driving with the old person sticker, that means they're even older than the 70-year-old limit. They're like at least 78. You will always see like someone will be driving poorly and then you're like, are they an old person? Yeah, they're an old person. Gotta give them some space. Pretend that this is okay. Yeah, I don't know. I think part of it is that they can't really take a lot of these old people's driver's licenses away because it's their only way to get around. And so they kind of just have to work around it. And so their best solution is to mark them in some way so people can jump out of the way when they need to.
Now, when you're driving in Japan, what side of the road are you driving on?
They adopted the British system because they were big fans of the British when they opened up to the world in the Meiji Restoration. And so they drive on the left side of the road.
How weird is that?
For like a week, you sort of have to focus on it. And then after that, it's like everything's normal. It just makes sense in your head.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you don't really notice.
Because in China, they drive on the right side of the road, the same as in America. In Hong Kong, they drive on the left side of the road.
How do you drive from China to Hong Kong?
Well, you don't. I was never at the border between Hong Kong and China, the land border. I always took the ferry across. My guess is they just have some one-way roads that lead in and out of the country at different ways.
That makes sense.
I don't know how many people drive across the border. I've never ridden a bus between countries before, but I guess if you ride a bus between Hong Kong and China, you have to stop and get off and go through security or something like that.
Oh, fun.
There's actually a transition point.
Well, according to Google Maps, there are bridges, but I don't see them in real life. Are they like tunnels?
From where to where? To Hong Kong mainland or Hong Kong island?
To the Hong Kong island itself.
Yeah, it's all tunnels under to the island.
Okay.
I believe, because it's all open in between. In China, because you are in a city with 1.5 million people, A lot of people do ride bikes. It always kind of struck me a little bit how many bikes there were, and a lot of them are electric. They're just people are just riding past you, and they're not moving their feet.
Right.
It doesn't sound like anything because it's electric. It's just zipping along, and they have. There were so many times a bike passes by, and it's a woman and like 3 children on this bike.
Sheesh.
It's like you'd have little kids just sitting in the back little seat thing, and then you have 1 or 2 more hanging on. Or it's just insane to me how people would never do this in the U.S. Like now that we're so safety conscious,
right,
with car seats and everything else, they're just holding on to people and holding on to umbrellas and driving down the road, weaving in between cars.
It's a different world.
Yep. And then there's a lot of 3-wheeled vehicles, some sort of rickshaw type thing, covered electric cart, kind of like a taxi that people take you around in for a couple kwai.
Right.
Or just a cart that it's like they got the back piled high with garbage or goods or something, and they're making deliveries.
So that's actually something I kind of wanted to talk about, is the prevalence of 3-wheel vehicles in Japan. So nowadays they aren't super popular, but basically the K car I mentioned earlier, it was only in the 90s when they upped the maximum to 660 cc's. It used to be 540, and before that it was 360. And so when your limit was 360 cc's, I think 4 wheels was sort of tricky to do. It was just too much weight. So back in the mid-60s, about half, actually in 1959, there were almost as many 3-wheel vehicles as cars, trucks, and buses and special purpose vehicles combined.
Oh, wow.
It was about 1 million total other vehicles, and then 750,000 3-wheelers.
Wow.
And so in the 60s, as cars like exploded in popularity, and it went from 1 million riders to 20 million riders by 1971, the 3-wheelers sort of diminished in popularity. But it's just sort of interesting to see that I guess they have a very different definition of what a car is. For such a long time, the limit for a lot of people was basically a motorcycle engine.
Yeah. I think some of that has to do, at least on the Chinese side, it has to do with the portability.
Right.
If you have a moped or a 3-wheeled bike of some sort, you can slip around traffic and drive on the sidewalk even when you're not supposed to. Although the streets were really wide in Zhuhai, you had traffic, probably multiple lanes of traffic, and then you had alongside the road is a bike lane and walking path, and then up beside that was another walking path with like a bike lane on it. So you had the road, and then you had a small barrier, and then at the same road level was like a fenced off area where people would bike, or there would be motorcycles or mopeds, 3-wheeled vehicles, people running deliveries for restaurants. And then a step up from there on the sidewalk, which was treacherous to walk on because it was brick and always kind of uneven, not level. Then you would have people walking along that, but there was also a like bike path along that. So there's always a lot of space for people to go.
So it seems like they sort of built around having a lot of traffic there.
Yeah. And Zhuhai is 30 years old.
Yeah.
Like the city was incorporated really recently. And I think a lot of China's infrastructure is built with the knowledge that there's going to be a huge amount of people doing stuff.
Right. See, that's actually a frustration I've had while driving in Japan. Not only are some of the roads small, but some areas are not built to handle the amount of people that are in it. So basically, Yonago, the next town over, has obscenely bad traffic in some areas for the population and the size that it is. They have traffic worse than the Twin Cities by like an order of magnitude, but they have a lower population. And that's because a ton of their roads are like 1 or 2 lanes, and there's no turn on red at stoplights. So when the lanes get stopped, you can't filter out all the people that are turning left at the stop. And you couple that with stoplights that aren't necessarily built to facilitate traffic movement. A lot of them are really low-tech timer ones. And then also, people here are taught to brake through their turns.
Wow.
So if you're going to turn, you slow down. And so they don't make it out of their turn until they pretty much almost stopped. Some people basically stop before they start going again. And so you'll end up with these traffic lines that are super long. The left side is stuck because people are slowly turning out and each one speeds up and then breaks through their turn so the next person can go. And then the right side is clogged up because the right turn lane is so full that the people that want to turn right have flooded into that lane as well. And then you couple all of this with the beautiful fact that some people have televisions on their dashboard that they watch whenever they stop.
Oh.
And everyone who doesn't have that is texting. So you end up with these long lines of cars that no one's paying attention of when to go. And you'll end up like waiting for a red light like 2 or 3 times to get like these 25 cars in front of you to pass through everything. As an American who's born into a world of driving that's all about like getting there fast, it somewhat frustrates me at times.
Yeah, that is something that really surprised me, is how much people were on their phones when they were driving.
Yeah, I think it's an issue in the US too, but it's harder to see because everyone's like more spaced apart.
Everyone's more spaced, and I mean, it is an issue, but it's like the number of times you have people watching videos while they're driving down the road.
Right. We don't do that in the US as much, I don't think.
That's frowned upon here.
Yeah.
I don't even know if it's against the rules there. I'd like to assume it is.
In Japan, it's legal to have a TV in your dashboard as long as it only plays when you're stopped. But from what I've read online, everyone who knows someone who has a TV, they just mod it so that it runs all the time.
Yeah.
Which is a super easy thing to do. You know, it's got a USB port. You stick the USB stick in, you pull it out or something like that, and it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, the driving culture, like, everything is just a little different. I think that's something that happens in every aspect of life when you live abroad. There are all those minute, I don't want to say minute, but minor differences that build up. And so everything's sort of the same, but different.
Mm-hmm.
So you have people like watching TV in their cars and slowing through turns, and everyone uses their signals here. Everyone in Japan uses their turn signal. It's the strangest thing. I can count on one hand the amount of times I've seen someone who doesn't.
Yeah.
So it's like, in some ways, the driving culture frustrates me as an American, and in other ways, it really impresses me that they follow certain traffic laws that Americans still, after 80 years of having huge numbers of cars, struggle with, flipping a switch as they turn.
The speed limit in Zhuhai and throughout most of China, I think within the city, it's around 40 kilometers per hour, which is about 25 miles per hour, I believe.
Yeah.
And even driving on the elevated highway, because the highways between some of these provinces are elevated and up in the air.
Right. Mm-hmm.
If I recall correctly, the sign said 80 kilometers per hour, which is less than 55 miles an hour.
Yep.
And I think part of the reason that maybe there weren't so many accidents and why people could be a little bit more distracted is because they drive slower.
Yeah.
And there definitely were times where people were driving over the speed limit, but the number of times you saw accidents, like usually I would see an accident once a month, and it was usually a pretty bad accident.
Mm-hmm.
But when you see people driving, you'd expect to see an accident every day.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery. It's almost exactly the same here. In-town speeds are around 40 or slower. There's a supermarket near where we live that has an 8-kilometer-an-hour speed limit for a little bit inside it. And I'm like, how are you supposed to follow that? You just idle your engine and hope you don't go too fast. But yeah, Japan reported, I want to say 1,300 traffic deaths last year. It's a new low for them.
Wow.
For a country of 120 million people, that's not too bad, especially when it includes like all kinds of being hit by a car, being in a collision, that kind of stuff. They crack down on drunk driving here extremely hard. Any amount of drinking counts as drinking under the influence.
Yeah, zero tolerance.
Yeah, it's about a $5,000 fine and minimum jail time.
Wow.
So in the last decade or so, they started to crack down on it hard, because before that it was a $500 fine and you could refuse the breathalyzer. Nowadays pretty much everyone agrees that you shouldn't ever drink anything and drive. I'm sure that's part of why driving's a little safer here, and the age you get your license is higher here too.
Oh really?
I want to say you drive at 18 or 20, one of those two.
Okay, a little bit more responsible.
Right.
One thing I noticed is there's a lot of taxi services because not everybody has a car.
Right.
There's a lot of what they call black taxis, which is people who drive just on their own and they aren't part of a company or anything. They aren't listed as a taxi. They're not registered. And then you could always get a car from WeChat with Didi or one of these other apps that you would get on your phone through WeChat. When you would have somebody drive, it would be interesting to watch them drive because the app they were using to navigate would tell them when the traffic cam was up ahead. So they'd drive whatever speed they wanted to, then slow down when they hit a traffic cam, and then speed up again.
Clever.
So they're definitely gaming the system a little bit.
You know, I haven't actually seen anyone get in trouble for speeding in Japan. I think it's kind of tricky for cops to catch speeders because the highways are mostly one lane. And so, you know, either the cop is going the speed limit and the speeder will catch up to them and then slow down, or the cop will never reach the speeder because the speeder's speeding.
Yeah. Driving down the road, occasionally there would be a light on a light post. A lot of the roads had medians in between, and there's either plants or just a barrier.
Mm-hmm.
But usually trees or plants in the middle of the road. And there are light posts along the way. And every now and then, one of them would have a red and blue light box on it. And that light box would occasionally flash red and blue, making you think there's a cop car there.
So it was just to, like, scare you?
Yeah.
Don't drive dangerously.
I don't know if those were in conjunction with the traffic cams or if those are just like a scare tactic, like remind you not to speed thing. But they wouldn't always flash, but every now and then they would flash. And you're like, is that? Oh, no, it's just a light on a post.
That is interesting.
There were a number of features I really loved with the way traffic worked in Zhuhai. It just flowed. It flowed like a liquid in a way you would not expect it to even be possible. Most of the main highways or the main roads through town had 3 or so lanes. So it's 3 lanes wide until you get to a stoplight. And at the stoplight, there's 4 lanes of traffic. So you have dotted white lines making 3 lanes, and then 50, like the last 50 meters or 30 meters up to the stoplight, those 3 lanes, they just stop showing those lines and then they start showing 4 lines. So when you're pulling up to a stoplight, you just dive into whichever lane is open or you want to.
Interesting.
And then when you start up, since everyone's starting up at a slightly different speed, you just all reform back into 3 lanes on the other side.
I feel like that's super dangerous, but it must work.
It works marvelously well. Usually there's like a turn lane, so you have like the inner lane is a turning lane, so you're kind of going from 3 lanes to 4 lanes with 1 turn lane. Not always though, because you can not always have a turn there. But yeah, there were never any big accidents. And sometimes people, when you're pulling up to a stoplight, people would just jump into the lane next to them in a way that in America, they would be rear-ended by the person coming up behind them.
Right.
But somehow they were able to jump out in front of oncoming traffic, or there was no oncoming traffic. And it just amazed me that there weren't more accidents like that. When we stopped at a stoplight, there were always countdowns on until the light was going to change.
Oh, that's nice.
So you always knew, how much time to... And the same with as the light was changing the other direction. You're like, how many seconds do I have before the light changed? I was a little skeptical at first. The American side of me is like, you're going to game that system hard. But either people didn't or they knew, like, okay, if you cut this too close, you're going to be in trouble because someone's going to hit you.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really neat. A lot of the turn lanes would allow for U-turns, and they would even have a light where it's like, this is the time to do a U-turn.
Interesting.
I think part of the reason for having the U-turns is just because the traffic infrastructure, while good, isn't complete, by which I mean it just didn't feel like it was where it needed to be for the amount of traffic going through.
Right.
It's like, here's these lanes of traffic going down here. There's a turnoff onto this side street, but if you miss your turn back there, or if you're stopping here and needing to go the other direction, like there's no way to do that unless you do a U-turn here, just because they don't have enough roads or they don't have roads in the right spot.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the best example of this, and one of the most terrifying things while being in China, I was once on a bus. We're on an elevated highway going somewhere, and the driver misses his exit. So he comes to a stop and backs up on the highway, and to take the exit he had to take.
Not okay.
As an American, like, that is one of the most terrifying things. Like, you do not do that. You do not back up on a highway. Like, that is no. But I honestly don't think if we would have kept going on that road, we might not have been able to turn around for a long time. And I suspect that's part of why he did that.
Yeah. Man, that's terrifying.
Drivers, when I went on a lot of tours with a bus for different events.
Mm-hmm.
It never felt like the bus drivers knew where they were supposed to go. We would get somewhere and then turn around because we actually weren't supposed to go there. We were supposed to go somewhere else. Or they would miss a turn and then they have to go into this courtyard, which is this tiled courtyard with a tree in the side of it. It doesn't even feel like you should be driving there. And he's trying to turn the bus around to go out down these super narrow streets that were not built for big buses to go down.
Right.
One time we're driving to a wedding and a bridge was out, but apparently nobody told the driver a bridge was out. So we got all the way to the bridge and then we had to go like 45 minutes around to get to the closest bridge and back up to where we were going.
Oh boy.
We were just a few kilometers from like the exit we needed, but we had to go all the way. It was not good.
See, that's such a different experience than what I've had with buses.
Yeah.
Every bus I've ridden here, whether long distance or short distance, it feels like they have it down to a science. They're like, we're going to be stopping here for 3 minutes. And your arrival time will be this time, which is the exact time we said it would be.
So how does a bus compare to riding a train?
There are so many different kinds of buses. We've ridden long distance buses where you have to get a ticket and stuff, which is kind of hard to do because you have to find the place that sells the ticket and then find the place where the bus is going to stop and then figure that out. But we've gotten it to work. And then there's like in-town buses.
Yeah, like a metro transit.
Sort of, except like even Akasaki has an in-town bus. I could ride the bus anywhere locally. When Haley and I hiked up the mountain to Senjo-san, there was a bus at the top of the mountain that we could ride down.
Do they have set stops then?
Yeah, every stop has a timetable somewhere. Most of the time, it's just a sign that says this stop plus a timetable that's like Xeroxed or rusted away so you can't see it. But then there are two kinds of buses. There's the flat fee buses, which are nice.
Mm-hmm.
Just when you're getting off, you throw in whatever money it says. And then there's the other buses where there's like this machine in front that you have to throw coins into and it doesn't give you change. So you better hope that you have 270 yen exactly, because if you put in a 500 yen coin, you just lost $2.
Mm-hmm.
But they're super convenient ways to get around, even in the rural middle of nowhere.
Okay, when I think bus, I think school bus, I think Greyhound bus. You get on, it's usually a couple steps up, and there are 2 seats on one side, an aisle, and 2 seats on the other side, and it seats somewhere between 30 and 50 people.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of maybe that's more of a long distance bus, right?
Yeah, the long distance buses were like that.
And the fancier models have a door halfway in the back, so you can get in and out.
Oh, wow. Never seen that. But
No? Okay. The buses we took to work, we took basically a coach bus from the place I lived to work every day at the school.
Oh.
They showed up on a timetable and would drop us off. So kind of what you would assume is a normal bus. There's space for luggage underneath, and there was a second door near the back so you could get on halfway. It made loading and unloading faster, except everyone went for the back door and not enough people went for the front door.
Oh.
So that's kind of the visual in my mind is for bus, but there are other types of bus.
Yeah, most short distance buses here are more close to a train. In general, they have single seats in the front, closer to the ground, and then they have some like seats that'll flip up into the wall if you need wheelchair space. And then in the back, they have like successively raised regular like 2 seats on each side things.
Yep.
And then poles everywhere to stand.
Yeah. That's the main metro bus system in Zhuhai was similar to that. I assume it's because the engine is in the back. So
yeah,
the seats are above there and there's maybe 16 seats or something back there getting progressively higher to the point where as a 6'2" American, my head is pushing up against the ceiling if I sit in the far, far back. And then the front section was mostly standing. Sometimes there's seats to the side to sit in and sometimes there's not. Depending on the style of bus, sometimes there's spaces for luggage, sometimes there's not. The fun thing with Zhuhai's bus system is it was all flat fee.
Interesting.
almost all of the buses were 3 kwai. Some of them were 2. I later learned that the 2 meant they didn't have air conditioning.
Oh.
And most of them did have air conditioning.
So you pay $1 or a kwai for AC?
Yep, about 15 cents for AC. And there was one fancy one which started up halfway through the year. It looked like an old trolley car and had a set route along the coast. And I think that was maybe 5 kwai to go on the scenic route.
Right.
Now, you said your buses, the buses there are usually on a schedule.
Yeah.
And they kept to that schedule pretty well?
They actually were late often. And I think it's mostly because old people ride them. And so they would get to their stop that they were supposed to be on time for, and then an old person sitting in the back would have to stand up. And some of these old people, like, standing up is a task.
It's a day's event.
So they would have to stand up and then get to the front, pull out their money, put the money in, walk to the edge of the bus, and then, like, climb down. And that whole process could take, like, 4 or 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And then the bus has to, like, catch back up. But I rode a bus to work when I worked at the honey workshop, and I would say once or twice it was, like, 15 minutes late, but most of the time it was, like, 5 minutes late.
Okay.
Because I think there were old people that got on and off. There was almost always one old lady or another on the bus.
The bus system in Zhuhai had no schedule.
What?
There was a WeChat app so you could tell where the buses were on the route, but you had to know which bus you wanted to be on which route. And so sometimes when there's multiple buses going to along the same route for a ways, you didn't know which one was going to come next. But basically, you knew usually within 20 minutes a bus would come by. Probably. If it wasn't the one you wanted, you just had to keep waiting. Sometimes 2 of the buses on the same route, like 2 3As would come by, one right after the other. And then you would wait for 45 minutes before the next one came through.
Oh, fun.
At one point in time, I guess there was a bus driver strike. So none of the buses were running.
Oh.
As a foreigner, I was not told this. I just knew that there were a lot of buses sitting at the bus station and not a lot of people driving them. It was very frustrating at times.
I bet.
That was in complete contrast to South Korea, where the bus stations, the stops on the side of the road, had television screens showing you about when to expect the next bus.
I don't know. Everything I hear about Korea makes it sound like this futuristic paradise, so that doesn't surprise me too much.
I got pretty good at standing on buses to the point where I could wrap my arm around a pole and read on my Kindle, or lean against a wall and read on my Kindle.
Mm-hmm.
In South Korea, the buses were more like half-size buses. They were short buses. They were tiny.
Yeah.
And they drove like maniacs to the point where when they would come to a stop, like most people were sitting down. I was standing, and I felt like my arm was going to get yanked off as like my whole body is like still flying forward as we come to a stop. I had never been on such a crazy ride as some of those buses getting around South Korea.
You should ride the metro in the Twin Cities.
I will have to try that out.
My story from the Twin Cities metro is I saw an old lady be thrown to the ground by a metro vehicle that can only go forward and backward and knows when it needs to stop.
A bus was somewhat crowded in Zhuhai, and every now and then the person would slam on their brakes. Every now and then you just have that time where, oops, somebody jumped out in front of it or a light change or something, and the bus driver slams on the brakes. And I was standing on one of the steps towards the back where it starts going up. I was standing on one of those steps. I had my hands above me on the crossbar, and we stopped so quickly that my feet slipped out from underneath me, and I was hanging on from that bar almost horizontal. And then I just kind of fell back into place, and I was fine, but I was like, whoa. I also sat, when Ruth was visiting in November, we were on a coach bus going to a place to visit, and I was sitting in the middle seat on the back row, and we hit a bump as the bus driver hit the brakes, and I flew about 2 seats forward in the air and landed in the aisle. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah, I can't say I had any flying through the air experiences in my time riding buses in Japan, so I guess you could consider that a weakness of the bus system here.
Or a strength, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, if you're so attached to the ground.
I did have one bus break down while I was on it, and they basically pushed us off at the next stop and had us get on a different bus. That was exciting. Okay, we're reaching a point here. We should wrap this up and continue talking about transportation next time.
That sounds good to me.
Okay, goodbye.
So do I hit the stop button now? Sure.